Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Inquiry lesson number 2. Today we are going to be learning about primary and secondary sources. So let's get started. Share the screen, which I forgot to do yesterday. Okay, don't want that. So this is a resource that I've printed for you. I've squeezed it onto one page, but hopefully that is very useful. So we've got primary sources, and there's lots of pictures and what they all are. So you've got letters, diaries, autobiographies, songs, tools, speeches, paintings, clothing, weapons, research or census data. These are original first-hand accounts of or objects from an event, topic or historical time. Then secondary sources are a second-hand account that interprets primary sources. They often use primary sources as a basis for their content. So you might have textbooks, commentaries, documentaries, essays, or research websites. So that sheet will be helpful to you. And then this is the PowerPoint for today. So we've got primary and secondary sources. Again, this is printed so you can use it. When we are trying to find out about a historical event, we need to look at sources to help us discover what happened. Historical sources are split into two main categories, primary and secondary. So there are the sheets that you've got. Primary or secondary? Can you come up with a definition for a primary source by reading the information below? So primary sources: a diary entry recalling events that were witnessed, a letter telling someone about something that they saw happening, photograph of an event, an artifact, e.g. a tool or a weapon from a particular time in history. Not primary sources: textbooks written by a historian, someone retelling stories they were told by their grandparents, an encyclopedia entry about an historical event, and an academic journal article written for pupils. So pause it now and have a think. Have a think about what would be a definition for a primary source. Feel free to pause it now. Okay. Primary sources are original, first-hand accounts of an event, topic, or historical time period. They are from the event itself, basically, either something you can hold, like an artifact that you can hold from the event, or somebody that was at the event. Secondary sources. So how would you define these? Look at the examples below to help you. So a textbook written by a historian, someone retelling stories, not telling their own story, but retelling somebody else's story, an encyclopedia entry about historical event, an academic journal article written for pupils. So a secondary source is a second-hand account. The person wasn't there, or a book's been written about what happened, but again, written by a historian, someone who's done it later on. It interprets primary sources. They often use primary sources as a basis for their content. So they use primary sources, but then they write about it. Which of these are primary sources and which are secondary? A lecture given in 2018 by a professor of the Victorian period about life in Edinburgh in the 1890s. So you could shout out primary or secondary. A letter from someone involved in Battle of Falkirk. A photograph of the Queen on the day she opened the Scottish Parliament. A textbook for school children about the Roman Empire, and a sword from the 1600s. So I'm just wondering if it's going to say on there. Oh, okay. So the first one, a lecture given, that would have been secondary because the lecturer wasn't there. The Victorian period happened over 100 years ago, so he definitely wasn't there. So he will have been using primary resources, but he is a secondary. To listen to him, he is a secondary source. A letter from somebody at the battle, that person was there, so that is a primary source. A photograph of the Queen is a photo from the day, so that is a primary source. A textbook for children, that would be a secondary source. Again, they will have used primary sources, but the textbook wasn't written in the Roman Empire. That was over 1,000 years ago. Wow, nearly 2,000 years ago. A sword from the 1600s, that has come from the actual time period, so that is a primary. So your answers there were secondary, primary, secondary, primary. There you go, it has got the answers. Advantages of primary sources. What are the advantages, do you think? So either have a talk about it, shout it out, just have a think to yourself and pause the video. Primary sources are eyewitness accounts, so they are generally considered to be more reliable. Secondary sources have had to interpret. So when you read something, when I read something, we might read it in a different way, maybe due to our own experiences, maybe due to how it was worded. So we might think of it in different ways. So that's why secondary then is maybe not always as reliable, but we'll come back to that in a minute. There's something else about primary sources that might make it unreliable. This means that when we read a secondary source, we are reading someone's perspective on a primary source. So we might not think the same as that person. However, here's a problem with primary sources. Here's a football match. Read these 2 primary sources from the football match. Right, the blue team. Our team was definitely better than the green team in the first half. They couldn't keep up with us. We should have had at least 2 penalties, but the referee was clearly on their side. In the second half, their striker got lucky and the ball bounced off him into our net. Our team kept fighting until the end, but we just couldn't quite get a goal back. We were just unlucky. And that's somebody who was watching the blue team and supporting the blue team. However, what the green team said, or the green team supporter. What a brilliant game. We deserved the win. Our players completely outplayed them. The referee made some really important decisions in the first half. The blue team thought they deserved a couple of penalties, but their players were just diving. Our striker scored an excellent goal in the second half. Their keeper never saw it coming. After that, their team just gave up. All in all, it was a fantastic win for us. So these are 2 people who watched the exact same game. Their eyewitness accounts don't match up. They watch the same event, but how can they be so different, or why are they so different? So have a think about that. So it's something called bias. If you're being biased one way, it means that you're supporting one way over another. So both of the previous sources were biased. Bias is a preference for or prejudice against something. In the case of football teams, each supporter had a particular bias for their team and against the other team. When we are reading sources, we have to be aware that there might be some bias, as this can affect the reliability of the information we can get from the source. I'm trying to think of a good examples about that. But if you that's something else to say. Just staying with football, is a commentator whose their paid job is to commentate on the game. If they had a bias towards one side, they wouldn't give a fair representation of the game. And if you're biased, you're being unfair. So I've used the word bias when I talk about a referee. So in hockey, if the umpire or the referee is giving decisions all the time against us, even though we haven't done something wrong or we've done the same thing as the other team, then you would say that they're biased because they seem to be supporting one team. Quite often, though, in sports, if you're the losing side, that's when people would complain about someone being biased. It might be true, it might not be. It might just be that you feel hard done by because you've lost. Equally, it might be that actually the umpire was biased. And the umpire is there, like a commentator, they need to be fair. They need to keep the game running fairly and smoothly. Right then. So today's task is to draw or write, or both, examples of primary and secondary sources. I've written resources. It should be sources. Primary source. So I did it like a table, and I was going to draw pictures in here and then just label them. So primary sources, you could draw like an art. You could draw a sword. You could draw a postcard. You could draw a picture, a letter, a photograph, a diary entry. You could draw or write all of those. On the secondary source side, you could say things like someone, a textbook, someone retelling their interpretation of a letter, or of somebody else, them telling you what their grandma had told them about experiencing World War II, for example. It could be watching a documentary, so somebody has taken lots of resources and then they've made a documentary on it, but it's kind of their point of view, their perspective. So I would draw or write about the primary and secondary sources, not resources. I will change that. The Romans, so further learning, we're going to be focusing on the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. Now, they came to Britain in 43 AD, so that is almost, well, that's 2,000 years ago. Almost 2,000 years ago, yeah. And they stayed until 1066, which is almost 1,000 years ago. So it was a long, long time ago. Do you think we will be mostly using primary or secondary sources for this topic? And why do you think that is? What examples of sources do you think we will use? So will we have swords? Will we have coins? Will we have clothing? Will we have toys? You know, what do you think we will have from those periods? And then can you find examples on the internet of primary or secondary sources about it? Okay, that is everything for today's learning. The reason I've talked about this is because we will be using primary and secondary sources through the topic, and I thought it would be useful to have a talk about what they are and the differences about them and the reliability about them both. So just gonna no, wrong one, that one, and share. So that's it for Tuesday, for day 2. I hope that will make sense to you, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing your work. Thanks so much, guys. See you tomorrow.